A legendary martial artist walks into a dojo, unannounced, unnoticed, until the arrogant sensei challenges him. What happens next will shatter his pride and his reputation. Keanu Reeves, calm and unassuming, faces off with the master in a battle of humility and ego. But will he end this match before the dojo even knows what hit them? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Koraku Martial Arts Academy stood quietly on a narrow street, its modest entrance hidden behind a simple set of sliding wooden doors framed with bamboo. A small neon sign above the door flickered erratically, casting a soft blue glow on the cobblestone pavement. The words Koraku Martial Arts Academy blinked in bold electric blue, a stark contrast to the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Inside, the dojo buzzed with energy. The sounds of steady footfalls, the sharp snap of punches, and the occasional grunt of exertion filled the air. The high ceilings allowed every movement to echo, giving the space an almost reverberating hum of determination. The dojo's wooden floor gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, its polished surface reflecting the precise movements of the students. The air was thick with concentration, their synchronized motions almost hypnotic. Each student wore the same white gi, crisp and immaculate, as they moved through their routines. Their forms were flawless, executed with the sharp precision of well-trained martial artists, honed by years of discipline. But despite the air of perfection, there was an underlying tension in the room, an intensity that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Along one of the walls, a collection of golden trophies sat under a spotlight. Each trophy gleamed in the artificial light, their polished surfaces shining as if trying to outdo each other. The plaques beneath them proudly displayed titles: National Champion 2019, Master of Flying Kicks 2020, Champion of the Year, Karate Master Tournament. Den sets up a tournament. These trophies were more than just prizes. They were symbols of a relentless pursuit of perfection, of fame, and of recognition in the martial arts world. For many of the students, they represented the ultimate goal. For the sensei who led them, they were the proof of his success, his mastery. The academy was a place of competition, where ego and ambition thrived. But even as the students moved in perfect unison, the dojo itself seemed to vibrate with a different energy, an energy that was about to be disturbed. Keanu Reeves entered the dojo with a quiet step, the soft rustle of his shoes barely audible against the polished floor. His attire was simple: jeans, a faded gray shirt, and a weathered jacket that looked as though it had been worn in more than a few places. There was nothing remarkable about his clothing, no flashy logos or designer threads to draw attention. He didn't need to announce himself. He simply moved forward, his presence barely noticeable to the students who were deeply focused on their training. They were too absorbed in their movements to notice him at first, each lost in their own rhythm, their own pursuit of mastery. Keanu paused at the edge of the mat, blending into the background. His posture was relaxed, but there was something undeniable about the way he stood, like a rock standing firm in the middle of a storm, calm and unshaken by the intensity of the surrounding chaos. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the flawless execution of each movement, the sharpness of each strike. It wasn't judgment that he felt, but an appreciation. He understood the dedication, the discipline it took to reach this level of skill. It reminded him of his own training, of the long hours spent learning the fundamentals, of the endless repetition of the basics until they became second nature. At the far end of the dojo, a small group of students were practicing a complicated sequence of kicks and strikes. Their movements were fluid, like a choreographed dance, each one seamlessly following the other. They were good, very good, but there was a certain rigidity to their form. It was as if they were performing for an audience, each movement designed to impress, to showcase their skill. There was no room for error, no room for vulnerability. Everything had to be perfect. Keanu couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of detachment from the display. There was a beauty in precision, yes, but there was also a danger in it. When you focused too much on perfection, you lost sight of what truly mattered. His eyes shifted to the other side of the dojo, where a young boy was practicing alone. He was no older than 10, his small frame still growing into the gi that was too big for him. His movements were less coordinated, his footwork shaky as he attempted a simple front kick. Each time he kicked, his balance wavered and his foot wobbled slightly in the air. But he didn't stop. He reset his stance and tried again. Sweat dripped from his forehead, his small face scrunched in concentration as he fought to maintain his composure. There was something about the boy's determination that drew Keanu's attention. It wasn't the grace of his movements or the precision of his technique, but the simple effort, the raw perseverance that came with each failed attempt. The boy wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to improve. Keanu recognized that kind of determination. It reminded him of his own early days in martial arts, when every punch, every kick was a struggle. He could almost hear the faint echoes of his own younger self, stumbling through the same movements under the watchful eye of his first instructor. The smell of old tatami mats, the sound of wooden floors creaking beneath his feet, the gentle corrections of a teacher who understood that true mastery came from humility and practice, not showmanship. Keanu felt a faint smile tug at the corner of his lips as he watched the boy try once more. It was the same struggle, the same determination that he had seen in so many other students over the years, and yet it always felt fresh. It was a reminder of what truly mattered. The journey, not the destination. The noise of the dojo faded into the background as Keanu stood there, observing, feeling the rhythm of the training hall settle around him. He wasn't here for the trophies or the accolades. He wasn't here to watch a demonstration of power or skill. He was here to witness the process, the effort, the dedication that went into becoming something more than just a fighter. The young boy's persistence spoke volumes to him. It was a reminder of the importance of the basics, of the quiet moments that built the foundation of every great martial artist. The sound of a clap broke through the silence. Keanu looked up to see Sensei Kenji Nakamura, the head instructor of Kuraku Martial Arts Academy, standing at the front of the room. Nakamura's posture was flawless, his gi crisp and meticulously pressed. He had the air of someone used to being in control, used to commanding attention. His movements were sharp and theatrical, every punch and kick designed to make a statement. He was performing, not teaching. He noticed Keanu almost immediately, his eyes narrowing with a hint of curiosity as they swept over the newcomer. Nakamura's expression quickly shifted to one of polite interest, though his ego seemed to puff up slightly as he took in Keanu's simple attire. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the dojo's energy, a shift that Keanu could feel. The students were still focused on their practice, but the sensei's presence was different. It was larger, louder, more commanding. Keanu could almost hear the unspoken challenge in Nakamura's gaze. This was his dojo, his space, and no one was going to steal his spotlight. "Welcome to Kuraku Martial Arts Academy," Nakamura said, his voice carrying across the room. It was warm, inviting, but there was an edge to it, a sense of condescension masked beneath the politeness. "Can I help you, sir?" Keanu simply nodded, his voice soft but clear. "I'm just here to watch," he said, his words carrying a subtle weight that Nakamura didn't immediately recognize. The sensei's eyes flicked to the students, who had begun to turn their attention to the newcomer. Keanu didn't seem like much, just an older man in casual clothes, but there was something about his presence that felt different. Nakamura's smile faltered for a moment before he masked it with a practiced grin. "Well," he said, stepping forward, "we don't normally allow spectators during training, but if you'd like to watch, you're welcome to stay." Keanu smiled politely, his eyes scanning the dojo once more. "Thank you," he replied, stepping further into the room, his presence barely a ripple against the backdrop of the dojo's intense energy. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He was content to observe. Keanu stood still at the edge of the mat, watching as the dojo's sensei, Kenji Nakamura, moved effortlessly at the front of the room. Nakamura was a man in his early 40s, in peak physical condition. His gi was a vivid white, trimmed with flashy gold lines that glimmered under the fluorescent lights, drawing attention to the sensei's every move. A black belt wrapped tightly around his waist, gleaming with the weight of years of training. But there was something more about Nakamura than his attire. It was the way he carried himself, the deliberate swagger in his posture, the way his every action seemed calculated to impress. He commanded the room without a word, and the students seemed to worship him without question. With a loud, authoritative clap, Nakamura silenced the room. His eyes swept across the students, scanning their forms with a critical yet satisfied gaze. The class snapped to attention, aligning themselves in perfect formation. Every movement they made mirrored his precisely, a perfect reflection of his skill and precision. Or at least, it seemed so on the surface. Keanu noticed the students' expressions, eager, tense, and filled with a quiet reverence. They were committed, but there was a nervousness about their devotion, an uncertainty beneath their disciplined stances. Nakamura's voice rang out, cutting through the air like the crack of a whip. "Now we will practice the flying kick combination." His words were spoken with such intensity that it was impossible not to notice the authority in his tone. As he demonstrated the first move, his body arced through the air with precision, but Keanu saw something in his movement, something that didn't sit right. The kick was perfect, yes, executed flawlessly, but it was too theatrical. It wasn't about the beauty of the technique or the practical effectiveness of the move. No, it was about impressing the audience, about showcasing his skill for the sake of applause. The students responded with equal dramatic flair, performing the move with sharp kicks and exaggerated forms. Keanu could feel the energy in the room shift from focus to performance. Each student was pushing themselves to mirror Nakamura's movements perfectly, trying to match his precision, his speed, his flair. But Keanu saw that some of the students weren't fully in control. Their bodies were moving in ways that looked flashy, but didn't quite seem grounded. There was no natural flow to their movements, just a need to impress. Nakamura was well aware of the attention. He reveled in it. His movements were so calculated, so deliberate, that it was clear he wasn't just teaching, he was performing. Every punch, every strike, every high, dramatic kick seemed designed not just to demonstrate skill, but to garner admiration. Keanu could see the pride in Nakamura's eyes as he glanced around the dojo, soaking in the approval of his students. He thrived on it. It was evident in the way he stretched his limbs with exaggerated grace, his posture always upright and his movements always crisp. There was no doubt in Nakamura's mind that he was the center of attention, and he enjoyed every second of it. As the students practiced their movements, Nakamura paused every now and then to correct a minor misstep or give a short lecture on the importance of power in a strike. His words were forceful, authoritative, and often punctuated with a proud, theatrical gesture. "Power comes from the core, from your heart," he proclaimed, his voice booming with command. "It's not enough to strike fast. You must strike with intention. Let every movement be an extension of your spirit." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Nakamura's theatrics. The sensei's words were not inherently wrong. Indeed, power in martial arts does come from within. But there was something about the way Nakamura spoke. His voice was filled with conviction, but it lacked the genuine humility that Keanu believed was at the heart of true mastery. It was as if Nakamura was using martial arts to elevate his own image, to prove something to himself and to others. He was building a reputation, not just as a skilled martial artist, but as someone above others, someone whose every word and movement demanded respect. "Again!" Nakamura shouted as a few students faltered. He clapped his hands loudly, a sharp sound that seemed to make the entire room jump. The students quickly reset, their movements synchronized once more, each striving to perform at the same level as their sensei. But in the eyes of Keanu, there was something off about the whole display. The dojo was filled with ambition, yes, but it felt like that ambition was rooted more in showing off than in true mastery. It felt like that ambition was rooted more in showing off than in true. Nakamura began to walk around the dojo, inspecting each student's form. As he passed them, he would offer a quick, sharp correction, nodding with satisfaction as they adjusted their positions. Every correction was followed by a nod or a smile of approval, a silent acknowledgement of his own expertise. He seemed to take pride in being the one to guide these students, to show them the way, but the way he carried himself, with such confidence, seemed to mask something deeper, a need for validation, a need to be seen as the best, as untouchable. Keanu's eyes followed Nakamura as he moved across the room, his gaze steady, thoughtful. He had encountered many instructors over the years, some humble, others egotistical, but Nakamura's arrogance was a different breed. It wasn't just in his attitude, it was in his very presence. He carried himself like a man who believed that martial arts were a means to elevate his own status, to place himself above others. Every movement he made was a performance, a declaration that he was the best, that he had reached a level beyond his students, beyond anyone else in the room. Keanu shifted his weight slightly, crossing his arms over his chest. The tension in the room was palpable, the students eager to impress their sensei, to be seen as worthy in his eyes. But Keanu didn't feel that same pressure. He wasn't here to prove anything, not to Nakamura, not to anyone. He had come to observe, to understand, but most of all, to see the students who were training for something beyond applause or trophies. His gaze shifted once more to the young boy, the one practicing on the far side of the dojo. The boy was struggling with a basic front kick, his movements shaky and uncertain. But there was no desperation in his effort. His stance was weak, his balance unsteady, but his determination was clear. He kept trying, kept repeating the motion, trying again and again despite the wobble in his steps. Keanu felt a quiet sense of admiration for the boy. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about the effort, the dedication to the craft, and the humility in simply trying to get better. This, Keanu thought, was what martial arts should be about. Not ego, not performance, but humility, perseverance, and the pursuit of personal mastery. Nakamura had stopped in front of the boy now, his expression shifting from amusement to mild annoyance. "You're still not getting it right," Nakamura said, his voice sharp. "Your kicks are weak, your stance is all wrong. You must learn to be powerful, do you understand?" The boy nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. He was trying again, resetting his stance, looking down at his feet as he gathered his courage. Keanu could see the uncertainty in the boy's eyes, but he also saw something else, an unspoken resolve. It wasn't the kind of resolve that came from trying to win or outdo others. It was the kind of resolve that came from within, from a place of quiet confidence in his own ability to improve. Nakamura, sensing that the boy's confidence was faltering, pressed on. "You'll never get anywhere in this dojo with that attitude. You have to be stronger, faster, better." The words were harsh, but they weren't entirely untrue. Strength and speed were important in martial arts, but there was something about Nakamura's delivery that made them feel hollow, superficial. Keanu's eyes flicked back to Nakamura, watching him as he hovered over the boy like a hawk, ready to pounce on any mistake. He could feel the tension in the room building, a quiet pressure mounting with every word Nakamura spoke. This wasn't just a dojo, it was a place where egos collided, where performance and spectacle overshadowed the true spirit of martial arts. As Nakamura walked away from the boy, his eyes briefly met Keanu's. There was a flicker of recognition, though it didn't seem to register immediately. but Keanu could sense that Nakamura's ego was pricked. The sensei was used to being the center of attention, used to being the one in control. But here, in this dojo, surrounded by the sound of his own students' effort, there was something else, something Keanu had quietly come to realize. Nakamura was more concerned with being seen as the best than with actually being the best. And that, Keanu knew, would be his downfall. Keanu moved through the sliding door with a soft step, the quiet sound of his shoes meeting the smooth wooden floor the only indication of his presence. He didn't announce himself. No dramatic entrance, no wave of attention followed him. The soft thud of his shoes against the floor was barely audible, yet the change in atmosphere was unmistakable. It was as if the very air around him shifted, though no one could pinpoint why. He removed his shoes at the entrance, as was customary in any dojo, and stepped onto the mat with a fluid grace that felt effortless. His movements were natural, calm, and purposeful. Unlike Nakamura's dramatic flair, Keanu didn't need to make a statement. His presence was understated but powerful, a quiet authority that didn't need to demand attention. The students continued practicing their forms, unaware of the man who had entered so subtly. Keanu stood at the back of the room, blending into the background like a shadow. His gaze swept over the dojo, taking in every detail, every movement. His eyes scanned the students, noting their postures, their techniques, their expressions. Each student moved with discipline, but Keanu's sharp eyes noticed the subtle flaws, the small imperfections. Despite their impressive displays, there was something lacking. The effort was clear, but the true spirit of martial arts was missing. Keanu's presence contrasted sharply with Nakamura's theatrics at the front of the room. While Nakamura basked in the attention, commanding the dojo with every gesture, Keanu remained still, his body relaxed but ever observant. His energy was calm, steady, and quiet, like the stillness of water before a ripple. It was a stark contrast to Nakamura's animated, dramatic performance. Keanu's body, though strong, didn't scream for recognition, it simply was. His physicality was a subtle force, built through years of practice, but it didn't need to be flaunted. He stood like a mountain, grounded, unmoving, but immense in its quiet strength. As Nakamura continued his lecture, directing the students through their complex movements, Keanu's attention shifted to one student in particular. Near the back of the dojo, a young boy, no older than 10, was practicing a basic front kick. His movements were clumsy, the kind of awkwardness only a beginner could know. His foot wobbled mid-air, and his balance teetered with each attempt. He was smaller than the others, with a slight frame, his white gi hanging loosely on his shoulder. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried again, wiping it away with the back of his hand. Keanu couldn't help but watch. The boy's determination was palpable, even in the midst of his struggle. His face was scrunched with concentration, his body wobbling with every failed attempt. But he didn't stop. He reset his stance, focused again, and tried once more. Keanu's heart softened as he watched. There was something raw and real in the boy's persistence, something familiar. It reminded him of his own early days of training, of trying and failing, of learning the basics again and again, until they became second nature. The boy's struggles echoed the early years of Keanu's own training, long before he became the person he was now. He could almost feel the weight of the training halls he'd walked into as a young man, the harshness of his first lessons and the steady guidance of his first instructor. Those days had been filled with the same determination, the same quiet pursuit of improvement. He had failed over and over, but each failure had been a lesson, and like the boy, Keanu had kept going. He had reset his stance, gathered his focus, and tried again. Keanu's gaze softened as he observed the child. The boy's kick was still unrefined, still shaky, but his resolve was undeniable. There was no showmanship in the way he practiced. There was no desire for applause or recognition. There was only the effort, the quiet will to improve. It was the very essence of martial arts that Keanu had always respected. It wasn't about flashy moves or gold trophies. It was about the quiet pursuit of mastery, of growing not for the approval of others, but for the sake of one's own betterment. Nakamura's voice interrupted Keanu's thoughts. He had noticed the young boy's struggles as well, though his response was less empathetic. Nakamura's eyes narrowed as he observed the child, his posture stiffening with impatience. He walked over to the boy, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor, his presence imposing. The students fell silent as Nakamura addressed the boy in his booming voice. "Your kick is weak," Nakamura said sharply. "Your stance is wrong. You need to be faster, stronger. Focus on the power in your strikes." His voice was full of authority, commanding the attention of the entire room. The boy lowered his head, unable to meet Nakamura's gaze. He nodded meekly but didn't respond. Keanu's eyes remained on the boy, sensing the weight of Nakamura's words. The child was embarrassed, his face turning red with shame. But instead of retreating into himself, the boy's hands clenched into fists. He straightened his back, wiped his brow again, and took his stance. He was determined to get it right. Keanu smiled faintly. This was what martial arts was about. The quiet strength of perseverance, the willingness to learn, and the humility to keep going despite failures. Nakamura, however, didn't seem to understand this. His words, though well-intentioned, were laced with a harshness that ignored the true spirit of martial arts. Keanu could see that the boy wasn't failing because he wasn't trying hard enough. He was failing because he was being pushed too quickly, without understanding the deeper lessons behind each movement. Keanu stepped forward just slightly, his presence still as unassuming as before. But now, Nakamura's attention was divided. He had sensed someone else in the room, someone who wasn't caught up in his performance. Nakamura's eyes flicked briefly toward Keanu, narrowing with curiosity. He could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, but instead of acknowledging it, he returned his focus to the students. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit that he might have missed something. Keanu's gaze shifted back to the boy, who was now attempting his kick once more. His foot still wobbled, but his focus was unwavering. The determination in his eyes hadn't faltered. He had faced Nakamura's harsh words with quiet defiance, continuing his practice in spite of them. Keanu admired that. It was a reminder of the purity of martial arts, the desire to learn, to improve, for no one else but oneself. As Nakamura continued to lead the class, Keanu found himself lost in thought, the memories of his own training days flooding back. He remembered the feeling of being underestimated, of being looked down upon by others who had been more advanced, more skilled. But Keanu had never let that stop him. His own journey had been slow, methodical, but it had led him to a place where he no longer sought validation from others. He had learned the value of quiet strength, of humility, and he had embraced the endless process of growth. The dojo's atmosphere felt different now. It wasn't just the students' movements or the way Nakamura led the class. There was something in the air that Keanu couldn't quite place, an undercurrent of tension, of expectation. It wasn't just about learning martial arts, it was about impressing someone, about showing off. The students, for all their discipline, were being taught to perform, not to truly understand the art of fighting. Keanu knew that his presence here might be noticed soon, and when it was, he wouldn't have to do anything dramatic. He wouldn't need to impress anyone. He was just here to observe, to see how far this dojo had come, and to witness the perseverance of a young boy who, in that moment, embodied everything martial arts should be about. It was a subtle reminder that the true power of martial arts wasn't in the spectacle. It was in the quiet persistence, the inner strength that grew from failure, from practice, from humility. As Keanu stood at the back of the dojo, quietly observing, he knew that his own story in martial arts wasn't so different from the boys. They were both here for the same reason, to become better. And in that moment, Keanu realized that he wasn't just here to watch the boy. He was here to see if Nakamura would ever realize that it was the journey, not the performance, that mattered most. As Nakamura continued his demonstration at the front of the dojo, he felt the shift in the air. It was subtle at first, like a change in the wind, but it wasn't lost on him. He could sense the gaze of someone observing him, someone who wasn't paying the usual attention, the kind of attention that came from awe or admiration. Instead, there was a quiet presence at the back of the room, watching without interruption. Nakamura's eyes flickered to the side, and his gaze landed on Keanu, standing at the far edge of the mat. For a split second, he froze. Keanu's posture was calm, his arms loosely crossed over his chest, his gaze steady but relaxed. He didn't look like someone who was in awe of Nakamura's skills. Instead, he was simply there, observing, as though he had all the time in the world to take in what was happening around him. Nakamura's pride flared up instantly. Who was this man standing at the edge of his dojo, so casually, so unremarkable, yet still managing to catch his attention? Nakamura had built this dojo, this empire of martial arts. He had crafted his persona, his sense of self-worth with every class, every trophy, every performance. And yet here was someone who clearly had no intention of being noticed, standing in the corner as if he owned the room. Nakamura's ego couldn't let that slide. He adjusted his stance slightly, his feet tapping the mat in sharp, deliberate motions. He slowly made his way across the room, his gaze never leaving Keanu. As he moved closer, he noticed the soft flicker of recognition in some of the students' eyes. They hadn't noticed Keanu until now, but now that Nakamura had singled him out, it was impossible not to pay attention. There was something intriguing about the quiet man standing there, a presence that seemed to quietly demand respect, even without asking for it. Nakamura approached Keanu with a swagger, his arms crossing in front of him as if he were daring the man to acknowledge his importance. A smug smile spread across his face, a smile he had perfected over the years in front of his students. He stopped just a few feet away from Keanu, his posture commanding, his eyes gleaming with condescension. "So," Nakamura began, his voice thick with arrogance, "what brings you to my dojo today, sir? You don't exactly look like someone interested in learning." His words hung in the air, dismissive and loaded with the subtle implication that Keanu was out of place here, as though he didn't belong. Keanu, for his part, didn't flinch. His expression remained unchanged, his calm energy unshaken by Nakamura's words. He didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one that was thick with the weight of the moment. Keanu finally spoke, his voice soft yet steady. "I'm just here to observe," he said, his tone polite, unassuming. The simplicity of Keanu's response seemed to catch Nakamura off guard. For a moment his smile faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to gauge Keanu's intent. Observe? Nakamura had expected something else. Perhaps he was expecting a challenge, or even a show of awe. But instead, Keanu's words hung in the air with a subtle challenge of their own, one that Nakamura couldn't quite place. It was a quiet defiance, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. Keanu's gentle response, devoid of any ego or desire for recognition, pricked Nakamura's pride in a way he hadn't anticipated. This man, standing so calmly at the back, was saying nothing but still taking up space. Nakamura's instincts told him to push harder, to assert his authority, to remind this stranger that he was the one in charge. But there was something about Keanu's calm demeanor that made Nakamura pause, just for a moment. The dojo, once filled with the sound of high-energy moves, seemed to fall into an eerie quiet as Nakamura processed Keanu's words. The students, sensing a change, turned their attention to the conversation unfolding in the center of the room. The claps of hands, the sound of feet shuffling, the grunts of exertion. All of it seemed to fade into the background. Nakamura, unwilling to let this unfamiliar situation shake him, tried to regain control. He lifted his chin slightly, allowing the smug smile to return to his face. "Observing, huh?" Nakamura said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Well, if you're here to watch, I suppose you're in for a real show." He gestured to his students, who had stopped their practice to watch the exchange. "My dojo is the best in the city. We don't just learn martial arts. We perform them. We push boundaries. We aim for greatness." His voice rang out with the kind of authority that made his words feel like a challenge, as though he were daring Keanu to disagree. Keanu's gaze remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a subtle, knowing glint that Nakamura missed. Keanu's response was simple, almost too simple to be taken seriously. "I'm not here to challenge anyone," he said, his voice still calm. "I'm just here to watch, like I said." There it was again, the quiet defiance. The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried a weight Nakamura couldn't ignore. Keanu wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. Nakamura felt the sharp sting of his pride. It was one thing to have people admire him. It was another to have someone not care at all, to show no desire for recognition. The thought left Nakamura with an uncomfortable knot in his chest. Nakamura forced a chuckle, trying to brush off the unease. "Very well," he said, his voice still condescending but tinged with a new edge. "You can watch, but I'll warn you, this isn't just any dojo. Here, we train hard. We don't just practice for the sake of it, we train to win, to be the best. That's what we do here, and maybe, if you're lucky, you'll pick up a thing or two just by being in the presence of greatness." His eyes gleamed as he said this, looking for any sign of reaction from Keanu, anything that might give him an opportunity to assert dominance. But Keanu remained unflinching, his face still as serene as ever. Keanu's gaze shifted briefly to the students, who were now watching him with varying degrees of curiosity and expectation. There was a faint hint of discomfort in their eyes, an uncertainty that came from seeing their sensei authority being questioned so publicly. Nakamura, clearly aware of this, quickly turned his attention back to Keanu, trying to reclaim the spotlight. "Well, if you're going to observe, you might as well learn something," Nakamura said with a mocking smile. "Let me show you what real martial arts looks like." He clapped his hands loudly, signaling for the students to continue. "Formations, everyone! Let's impress our guest." His words were commanding, but there was a slight tremor in his voice, something that hinted at the insecurity lurking beneath his surface. Keanu watched as the students reluctantly resumed their practice, though the energy in the room had shifted. They were still moving with the same precision, but now there was a sense of tension in their movements. They were no longer just practicing, they were performing, trying to meet an expectation that was only partly their own. Nakamura's eyes flicked back to Keanu, searching for any sign of approval, any sign that Keanu might be impressed. It was the same way, but Keanu didn't look impressed. He simply watched, his eyes steady and calm. Keanu wasn't there to be impressed. He wasn't there to measure himself against Nakamura's bravado or his students' precision. He was there to observe the heart of the dojo, to see if the true spirit of martial arts was alive within its walls. Nakamura's attempts to command the room, to make every moment a spectacle, only served to distance the dojo from the deeper lessons that Keanu valued. Keanu felt the weight of the moment settle around him. He wasn't here to prove anything. But Nakamura, he was desperate to prove himself, to prove that he was the best, that his dojo was the best. And the more he tried to assert his dominance, the more Keanu could see through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. As Nakamura turned away, continuing his performance for the students, Keanu remained rooted to the spot. He wasn't going to engage in this game of ego. He wasn't going to fight for the spotlight. But he knew, deep down, that the true test of martial arts wasn't in the spectacle. It was in the quiet moments, the ones that Nakamura so desperately tried to avoid. As the class continued, the energy in the dojo shifted. Students whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the man standing at the back of the room. Keanu, still a quiet figure in the corner, had begun to draw attention without intending to. His calm presence, his understated strength, seemed to contrast everything that Nakamura was projecting. The sensei's theatrical display of power and skill, meant to command the room, suddenly felt less impressive in the face of this quiet observer. The whispers grew, and Nakamura's sharp ears caught the murmurs. He could see his students exchanging glances, their attention momentarily diverted from him. It wasn't just the boy practicing his front kicks or the students trying to perfect their moves anymore. It was Keanu. His very presence was unsettling. The more Nakamura tried to hold the room's focus, the more he felt it slipping away. The discomfort grew in his chest like a slow-burning fire. Nakamura prided himself on his ability to command attention, on his status as the dojo's undisputed leader. He had built this place from the ground up, turning it into a center of excellence, a place where only the most dedicated and talented students could thrive. But now this stranger, this quiet man, was threatening that control, drawing the focus of his students away from him. The whispers grew louder in Nakamura's mind, a constant hum of self-doubt. Who was this man? Nakamura's thoughts simmered with frustration. He didn't like the feeling that came from being undermined in his own dojo, even if it was unintentional. And then, like a rush of cold air, the thought hit him. What if this man was mocking him? What if he was standing there, silently judging Nakamura's every move? Nakamura's jaw tightened, his gaze sharpening. He needed to assert his dominance, to make sure everyone in the room understood who was in charge. He turned toward Keanu, his eyes narrowing. His pride couldn't let this go on. This man's quiet demeanor had to be challenged. If he truly thought he was better, then let him prove it. The students were watching, and Nakamura needed to remind them that this dojo was his domain, that he was the one who set the standard. He took a few confident strides toward Keanu, his steps deliberate, his posture squared. The students fell silent, sensing the shift in the air. Nakamura stood before Keanu now, his arms crossed in a posture that exuded authority. His eyes gleamed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, but it was a smile tinged with something darker, a smile that hid the insecurity building inside him. He had to challenge this man, to force him to engage, to put him in his place. "Tell me," Nakamura began, his voice louder now, commanding, "are you here just to observe, or do you think you can handle what we're doing here?" His tone was dismissive, as if implying that someone like Keanu wouldn't be able to keep up. The students watched in rapt attention, their eyes flicking between the two men. "This isn't some recreational club. We train to be the best here." He let the words hang in the air, as though daring Keanu to react. Keanu's eyes remained calm, his expression unreadable as he met Nakamura's gaze. He didn't flinch, didn't shift his stance. He simply stood there, still as a stone, the only movement in his body the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. Nakamura's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly masked it with renewed bravado. "If you're truly here to observe, then I suppose it's only fair to let you see what real martial arts looks like." He let out a small, dismissive laugh, his eyes flicking toward the students. He knew they were watching, waiting for him to take charge of the situation. They were expecting him to assert his dominance over this quiet man who had dared to step into his dojo. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Nakamura, his gaze steady and unflinching. There was no challenge in his eyes, no eagerness to fight. His energy remained calm, grounded, untouched by the theatrics Nakamura had put on display. Nakamura's patience was thinning. He had expected a reaction, some sign that Keanu was intimidated, that he would back down, but the man remained silent, as though uninterested in whatever Nakamura was trying to provoke. Keanu finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. "I'm not here to fight, Sensei," he said, his tone calm and almost apologetic. "I'm here to observe, to watch. That's all." For a moment, Nakamura was stunned. His smug smile dropped for the briefest of moments, his eyes flickering with something akin to confusion. "He's not here to fight?" The words rattled through Nakamura's mind, disorienting him for a split second. Was this man really not interested in proving himself? Didn't he know who Nakamura was? Didn't he understand that stepping into his dojo was an implicit challenge? Nakamura's pride surged again, this time stronger than before. How dare this man come into his dojo and act as if he didn't care about the challenges Nakamura had set before him? Who did he think he was? "Observe," Nakamura repeated, his voice rising slightly, tinged with mockery. "That's all? Just here to watch? You're in my dojo and you think you can just stand there and watch?" He took a step closer, the smile on his face now stretched thin, revealing the growing tension in his chest. "You're either here to learn or you're wasting my time." Keanu remained unmoved, his posture still as relaxed as ever. He gave Nakamura a small smile, one that carried no trace of arrogance or defiance. It was simply an acknowledgement of the situation, a quiet response to the rising tension in the room. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time," Keanu replied gently. "I'm simply here to watch." His tone was respectful, but there was an underlying strength in the simplicity of his words. The silence in the dojo thickened, and Nakamura's frustration grew. How could this man be so calm, so collected in the face of his challenge? Nakamura's reputation was on the line. His ego was on the line. The students were watching, waiting for him to prove himself, to assert his authority. Keanu was standing there, still and calm, showing no sign of backing down or being intimidated. It only served to frustrate Nakamura more. "You know," Nakamura said, stepping even closer now, his voice sharp with edge. "Maybe you think you're above all of this, but if you're really here to observe, why don't you put your skills to the test?" He paused, letting the words linger in the air. "Perhaps we should see how much you've really learned just by watching." His eyes gleamed, a hint of challenge creeping into his expression. Keanu's expression didn't change. He remained quiet for a moment, simply looking at Nakamura, letting the challenge hang in the air. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I'm not here for a challenge," he repeated, his voice soft yet unwavering. But Nakamura wasn't done. His pride wouldn't let him back down. This was his dojo, his students, his reputation. Keanu's refusal to engage, his quiet, composed demeanor, was an affront to everything Nakamura had built for himself. The thought of being dismissed so easily, of being looked at with such calm indifference, stoked the flames of his pride. "I insist," Nakamura said, his tone becoming more forceful now, a clear shift in his approach. "I think it's time we see just how much you've truly mastered. Perhaps a little demonstration would be in order. Don't you think?" He gestured grandly, his voice rising to make sure every student in the room could hear. Keanu stood still, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to make a spectacle of the situation. Nakamura was pushing him, but Keanu had no intention of feeding into that ego. Yet Nakamura insisted, his tone laced with condescension. The challenge had been thrown down, and now Keanu had to decide. Would he continue to stay silent, or would he engage? The room waited for Keanu's response, the air thick with anticipation. The dojo fell into an uneasy silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft creak of the wooden floor, the only sounds breaking the stillness. Keanu stepped onto the mat, his movements deliberate but unhurried. The students, who had been whispering among themselves, now turned their full attention to the unfolding drama. Keanu's calm presence stood in stark contrast to the tense energy in the room. They had all seen Sensei Nakamura spar with others before, but today something felt different. There was an edge to the air, a charge of electricity, as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. Nakamura puffed up his chest, his posture rigid with pride, eager to show off, to remind everyone in the room who was in charge. He was the sensei, the one who commanded attention, the one who had built this dojo into what it was. But Keanu? He wasn't trying to be impressive. He wasn't here to prove anything. The more Nakamura tried to loom larger, the more Keanu seemed to shrink away from the limelight. His stance was still, composed, almost meditative. His eyes were calm, assessing, not with the intense energy Nakamura exuded, but with a quiet focus that said he was entirely present in the moment. The students looked between the two men, sensing the growing tension. They were unsure of what to expect. Nakamura was the flashy showman, the one who made every fight a spectacle, and they anticipated the same today. But Keanu wasn't responding in the way they thought he would. He wasn't charging in, throwing punches, or making any kind of grand display. Instead, he was simply there, waiting, watching. Nakamura's eyes narrowed as he sized Keanu up. His lips curled into a smile that was both confident and just a little too sharp, as though he were already planning how to make this match a statement. He had seen the subtle glance of respect, the calm that seemed to envelop Keanu's entire being, and Nakamura couldn't let that go unchallenged. He wasn't about to let anyone, especially not some quiet observer, walk into his dojo and make him feel small. With a sudden movement, Nakamura stepped forward. His footwork was sharp and exaggerated, the kind of flashy technique he often used in front of his students. He threw a couple of quick, dramatic punches, his fists cutting through the air with the speed of someone who wanted to impress, who wanted to show that he was faster, better, and stronger than his opponent. His movements were calculated to be showy, to create the illusion of skill without ever being truly threatening. Every punch, every kick, was designed to be seen, to draw attention to how much power he could generate. But Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't take the bait. Nakamura's strikes missed by inches, but they weren't intended to land. They were meant to test, to probe, to create space for a more dramatic follow-up. Keanu simply stepped back with the faintest of movements, allowing Nakamura's strikes to pass him by. There was no sharp evasion, no extravagant footwork. Just a gentle sidestep, as if the punches had never even come close. The students were watching closely now, their breath held in anticipation. This wasn't what they had expected. Nakamura had been so sure of his own superiority, so convinced that his flashiness would overwhelm Keanu. But there was no response from Keanu, no sign of any challenge. The more Nakamura pressed, the more he began to feel the subtle frustration of his own overconfidence. Nakamura, sensing the shift, decided to push harder. He began to move faster, launching another series of strikes, this time aiming for Keanu's head and torso, mixing punches with sweeping kicks that arced through the air with incredible speed. He was trying to outpace Keanu, trying to catch him off guard with his speed and power. But Keanu's body language remained unchanged. He wasn't watching Nakamura with fear or doubt. He was simply observing, his eyes following each movement with an almost calm curiosity. It was becoming increasingly clear to the students that this wasn't going to be the dramatic showdown they had imagined. They had expected a fight full of explosive energy, with Nakamura dominating the dojo, proving his worth as a martial artist. But Keanu wasn't engaging in the same way. He wasn't playing into the spectacle Nakamura was creating. Instead, he was quietly standing his ground, waiting for Nakamura to tire himself out, for the tension to reach its peak. Nakamura's frustration began to build. He was fast, he was skilled, but the more he attacked, the more he realized that Keanu wasn't even trying to defend himself in the way he'd expected. There was no aggression, no urgency in Keanu's movements. He wasn't fighting to win, he wasn't fighting at all. He was simply existing, letting Nakamura show off, letting the younger man expend all his energy without ever acknowledging it as a challenge. The students, who had been expecting a fight filled with intense moves and dramatic moments, were now unsure whether to be in awe or in disbelief. They were watching a sensei who was throwing his best moves and landing nothing but air, and they were watching Keanu, who wasn't moving with force but with grace. There was a quiet power in the way Keanu moved, a subtle mastery that spoke more loudly than Nakamura's loud showmanship. Nakamura's confidence began to waver. The frustration that had been building inside him now bubbled to the surface, and he launched himself into an even more exaggerated display of power. He threw a series of rapid strikes, each one more aggressive, more forceful than the last, hoping to overwhelm Keanu, hoping to make him respond. But Keanu remained unchanged. His eyes, calm and focused, never wavered from Nakamura's movements. His posture, still and centered, seemed to absorb each of Nakamura's attacks without even the slightest strain. The students exchanged uneasy glances. They had been waiting for the dramatic explosion, for the clash of titans, for the moment when Nakamura's power would prove to be too much for Keanu. But instead, they were watching a masterclass in restraint. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Keanu wasn't reacting because he didn't need to. He didn't need to show off. He wasn't concerned with Nakamura's attempts to impress. Finally, Nakamura took a step back, breathing heavily now, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He was no longer in control. The room that had once felt like his stage now seemed too small for his frustration. The silence between him and Keanu grew thicker, the anticipation mounting. Nakamura wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to regain his composure, but his eyes never left Keanu. Keanu's calmness, his effortless defense, had changed the dynamic entirely. He had not struck back, not in the way Nakamura had hoped. But in his silence, in his stillness, he had exposed the fragility of Nakamura's pride. It was a subtle shift, a change that would be impossible for most to recognize. But Nakamura felt it. He had been pushing harder and harder, trying to impress, trying to force a reaction. But Keanu had only met him with quiet strength. For the first time in the match, Nakamura realized that the spectacle, the performance, had lost its power. Keanu's nonchalance had disarmed him in a way no fight could. The students were no longer watching with awe or excitement. They were watching with curiosity. What was happening here was something different. It wasn't the flashiest display of skill or power. It was the quiet mastery of someone who didn't need to prove anything at all. And that, Nakamura realized, was what made this fight different. Keanu didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The tension in the room had shifted, and Nakamura was beginning to feel the weight of his own vulnerability. The tension in the dojo had reached a breaking point. The students who had been watching with wide eyes could feel the air thickening, every breath held in anticipation. Nakamura's jaw was set tight, his face flushed with frustration, his body tense with the effort to prove something, anything, to the silent figure in front of him. He had already made a spectacle of himself, throwing move after move, each designed to dazzle, to dominate, to impress. But Keanu had not reacted the way he had expected. It was time to change that. Without warning, Nakamura launched himself forward, his body moving in a blur of motion. His feet moved quickly, sliding across the dojo floor as he attacked, his strikes coming faster now, more forcefully. His punches were rapid, each one aimed with the intention of overwhelming Keanu. He threw a roundhouse kick, then a series of jabs, a swift knee, and a spinning back fist, all calculated for speed, all meant to catch Keanu off guard. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to move much. The first punch came toward his chest, and without any sign of effort, Keanu tilted his torso slightly to the side, allowing the punch to glide past him. It wasn't a block, nor a dodge. It was simply the natural movement of his body, an effortless shift to redirect the force. The second punch, aimed for his face, came with the same intensity, But Keanu just stepped to the left, his body flowing with the attack. It passed him by, the wind of the strike grazing his cheek, but it never touched him. The next few kicks came in quick succession, each one more aggressive than the last, as Nakamura tried to trap Keanu into a corner, tried to force him to respond. The first kick aimed at his midsection, and Keanu simply leaned back, his body moving with a fluid grace that made it look as if the attack had missed by miles. Nakamura's foot whistled past, only to meet empty air. But Keanu wasn't done yet. As Nakamura shifted his weight for another kick, Keanu's arm lifted slightly, a gentle parry, and the force of Nakamura's strike was guided off to the side. The movement was so subtle that it almost seemed like it hadn't happened at all. Yet Nakamura's momentum was off, the angle of his attack disrupted. His foot landed awkwardly, forcing him to recover his balance, but Keanu didn't press the advantage. Instead, he remained still, his body loose, his stance unassuming, waiting for the next attack. Nakamura, now more agitated than ever, threw a series of wild punches, each one more desperate than the last. His movements were fast and dramatic, but they were becoming more erratic, more theatrical, as if the sheer power of his attacks should be enough to overwhelm Keanu. But Keanu's responses were calm, minimal. Each deflection, each redirection, was so effortless that it looked like he wasn't even trying. He was letting Nakamura tire himself out, using just enough movement to divert the incoming force without ever seeming like he was engaged in the fight at all. The students, who had initially been watching with eager excitement, began to murmur among themselves. They had expected a confrontation, a battle of raw power, of speed, of skill. They had seen Nakamura spar with others before, and they knew what to expect. The quick strikes, the showmanship, the flashy displays of power that were meant to make an impression. But this was different. Nakamura, the master of performance, was throwing everything he had at Keanu. And yet Keanu wasn't engaging. He wasn't being overwhelmed by the force of Nakamura's strikes. He wasn't even reacting in the way they thought he would. The air in the dojo shifted from excitement to confusion. The students could feel the subtle tension building, a shift that wasn't about the fight. It was about something deeper. Nakamura had always been the one in control, always the one to lead the show. But now, his frustration was palpable. He was pushing harder, attacking faster, but it wasn't working. Keanu wasn't retaliating. He wasn't getting caught in the trap. He wasn't playing into Nakamura's ego-driven performance. A few students exchanged glances, their eyes wide with uncertainty. They were used to seeing their sensei overpower opponents with his fast, exaggerated techniques. But here, Keanu wasn't trying to counterattack or even block with force. He was redirecting Nakamura's movements with a fluidity that left no room for Nakamura's strikes to land. Every punch, every kick, every dramatic movement Nakamura made seemed to fall short, like they had been anticipated before they even left his body. And that's when it happened. Nakamura, pushed beyond his limits, began to move faster than ever before, a series of jabs and kicks meant to hit with relentless speed. His moves were not just designed to attack anymore. They were meant to trap, to corner, to break through the calm of Keanu's presence. But with each strike, Keanu's body seemed to flow with the attack, not against it. A punch came toward his chest. He stepped to the side. A kick followed to his ribs. He pivoted, guiding it past him. It was almost as if Keanu was one step ahead, not because he was moving faster, but because he understood the rhythm of the fight, the ebb and flow of Nakamura's energy. Keanu didn't need to rush. He didn't need to force an answer. He simply allowed the energy to pass, redirecting it, guiding it, letting Nakamura expend all of his strength. As Nakamura grew more and more frustrated, his strikes became wilder, less controlled. His breathing grew heavier as the adrenaline surged and sweat began to drip from his forehead. He had been used to commanding the dojo, used to being the one who showed the students what it meant to dominate. But Keanu's lack of engagement was beginning to unravel his confidence. The more Nakamura threw punches, the more he realized that Keanu wasn't going to fight back. It wasn't that Keanu couldn't, It was that Keanu didn't need to. And that was the thing Nakamura couldn't understand. Keanu's calmness, his unhurried movements, began to disorient Nakamura. The sensei was used to being the one who created the tension, the one who dictated the flow of the fight. But now Nakamura was the one who felt like he was chasing a moving target, like he was trying to keep up with a shadow that was always one step ahead. The students could sense the shift, too. The initial excitement was replaced by an unease, a realization that this wasn't the fight they had expected. Keanu, still unhurried, continued to redirect Nakamura's movements with grace. Each of Nakamura's aggressive strikes was met with the same subtle deflection, the same fluid response. Keanu's movements were so understated that it almost seemed like he wasn't even trying. His body was a study in control, his calm energy a stark contrast to Nakamura's growing frustration. Nakamura, now fully aware that his flashy attacks were failing, gritted his teeth. His movements became faster, more erratic, a blur of strikes meant to overwhelm Keanu, to make him slip, to find an opening. But Keanu never slipped. He never faltered. Each of Nakamura's attacks was absorbed into the stillness of Keanu's presence. Until Nakamura's own body grew tired, his energy spent. Keanu's smile remained faint, his eyes never leaving Nakamura's. He wasn't waiting for Nakamura to tire out, but it was clear that was happening. Nakamura's frustration grew, his pride stung with every deflected punch, with every kick that missed by mere inches. The dojo, once filled with the sharp sounds of Nakamura's attacks, now hummed with the quiet rhythm of Keanu's calm, unyielding presence. The students were no longer watching in awe, they were watching in confusion. The fight they had expected, the fight they had been taught to look for, wasn't happening. Instead, they were witnessing a different kind of mastery, one that didn't rely on speed, on power, or on showmanship. It was a lesson in patience, in control, and in restraint. And with each missed attack, with each wild strike that failed to connect, Nakamura's dominance over the dojo began to crumble. Keanu wasn't just deflecting attacks, he was redefining the very nature of the fight. The real question now was not if Keanu would fight back, but whether Nakamura could even catch him. Nakamura stood tall, his body trembling slightly from the force of the attacks that had already come and gone, his pride simmering just beneath the surface. He had been humbled in a way that didn't sit well with him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the sensei, the master of this dojo. And yet, every move he made was effortlessly avoided by Keanu. The students' murmurs grew louder, and Nakamura's frustration mounted. He could feel the weight of their eyes, their judgment, as they watched him flounder in front of them. His flashy moves, his dramatic strikes, none of it was landing. Keanu wasn't even breaking a sweat. In fact, it was starting to feel like Keanu was enjoying the spectacle of Nakamura's failures. That thought stung Nakamura's ego deeper than any physical strike ever could. He tried to rein in his thoughts. He was a master. He had been practicing martial arts for decades, honing his skills to a razor's edge. He had taught hundreds of students, some of whom had gone on to win tournaments and claim titles. He had built this dojo, crafted his reputation, and in one moment, all of it was beginning to slip through his fingers like sand. A sharp inhale filled Nakamura's lungs as he turned toward Keanu, his face now set in a scowl. He couldn't let this go on. Not here, not now. His students were watching. He would not allow Keanu to make a fool of him in front of them. Without thinking, Nakamura surged forward. His feet moved with a burst of energy, his body shifting into a stance that was meant to impress. He was no longer just fighting. He was performing, using his body to create an image of power, to make up for the silence that Keanu had placed over the dojo. This wasn't about the fight anymore. It was about regaining control. He threw a spinning kick, aiming for Keanu's head. The move was fast, the leg whipping through the air with the grace of a dancer. It was beautiful in its precision, a striking combination of strength and technique. But Keanu's response was immediate. Without a hint of urgency, he shifted his body ever so slightly to the side, stepping out of the way as the foot sailed past him. The kick missed by mere inches, but it was enough to throw Nakamura off balance. He landed awkwardly on one foot, his body's momentum carrying him forward. Keanu, still poised, didn't move to capitalize on the misstep. He simply watched, his calm eyes never wavering, as Nakamura scrambled to regain his footing. The students exchanged uneasy glances, their excitement ebbing away. Nakamura, embarrassed but unwilling to admit defeat, quickly regained his posture. He let out a breath, wiping the sweat from his brow, and squared his shoulders. He wouldn't let this quiet man, this observer, see him falter. He would show him the complexity of true martial artistry. If flashy moves wouldn't work, then something more intricate would. Nakamura's movements became faster, more deliberate, as he prepared to unleash his next combination. He would do something Keanu couldn't ignore. He would dazzle, impress, and regain the confidence he had lost. "I am the master here," Nakamura reminded himself. He was in control. He had to be. With a sudden burst of energy, Nakamura shifted into a new stance. His feet slid across the floor, his body positioned for the next attack. He threw a high, roundhouse kick with precision, followed by a swift jab and a low sweep. Each move flowed into the next, the combination designed to overwhelm, to confuse, to trap Keanu into responding. But again, Keanu did nothing. His body was still. He didn't move in the way Nakamura expected. He didn't try to block or counter. He simply allowed each of Nakamura's strikes to pass him by. Each punch, each kick, each elaborate move Nakamura made was rendered useless by Keanu's subtle redirections. Nakamura's frustration flared once more. He was giving it everything he had worked for, and it was as though Keanu wasn't even trying. He was simply standing there, letting Nakamura waste his energy. The students were silent now. The energy in the dojo had shifted from excitement to confusion. They had expected a dramatic display, an explosive show of strength and skill. Instead, they were watching Nakamura move faster and harder, only to find that his attacks had no effect. They were watching him try to overwhelm Keanu, only to realize that Keanu wasn't being overwhelmed at all. Nakamura's frustration reached a boiling point. He had tried everything, his flashiest moves, his most intricate combinations, and none of them had worked. Keanu stood there, poised and unyielding, making every attack feel like it was nothing more than air. Nakamura's muscles burned from the exertion, and the eyes of the students weighed heavily on him, adding to the pressure. In that moment, Nakamura realized what he had been missing all along. His entire approach had been built on ego. It wasn't about true mastery. It was about showing off, about proving to everyone watching that he was the best. And Keanu was showing him something different, something quieter, something deeper. Keanu wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't seeking validation. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. The thought struck Nakamura like a blow to the chest. I've been performing, but he's been teaching. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim control, Nakamura launched himself forward again, this time without the flair, without the theatrics. His movements were raw, driven by his frustration, but his mind was clouded by pride. His kicks were wild, his punches more reckless. He wasn't thinking about technique anymore. He was thinking about one thing: winning. But once again, Keanu remained calm. He avoided every strike with barely a movement, his body flowing effortlessly to the side, letting Nakamura's attacks pass him by. The students could feel the shift in the dojo. It wasn't just a sparring match now, it was a lesson in humility, in control, and in patience. Nakamura's energy was almost spent. His muscles ached, his breath came in sharp gasps, and his movements had lost their finesse. Keanu's calm had broken something inside Nakamura that no punch or kick could fix. The dojo had changed, and Nakamura could no longer deny it. Nakamura's breath was coming in heavy bursts now, his body slick with sweat, his arms feeling the strain of each punch thrown in frustration. His movements, once smooth and controlled, had become increasingly wild, more desperate. With each passing second, his frustration mounted. This man was still standing, still moving with the same fluid, effortless grace, and Nakamura couldn't get past him. It was like trying to strike at a shadow, always just out of reach. The dojo was silent, save for the sharp sound of Nakamura's heavy breathing and the soft shuffle of Keanu's feet as he moved to avoid every strike. It was almost eerie, the stillness of Keanu's movements compared to the chaos of Nakamura's attacks. The tension in the room built with every failed strike. Nakamura's pride, which had been so loud and strong at the beginning, was crumbling in silence now. The students, once full of excitement, were watching in stunned silence, unsure of what they were seeing. Nakamura's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward again, launching another series of rapid punches, each one coming faster than the last. His fists cut through the air like they were meant to tear through Keanu's defenses, but Keanu's response was the same. He didn't block or counterattack. He simply moved. Every punch that came toward him was redirected with the slightest tilt of his body, the gentlest shift of his weight. Nakamura's punches fell harmlessly to the side, his own momentum carrying him forward, making him look even more out of control. The students watched in awe, some still whispering among themselves, others simply frozen in place. They had expected a battle, an explosion of power, of quick, decisive strikes, but what they were witnessing was something else entirely. Keanu wasn't engaging in the same way Nakamura had. He wasn't meeting the aggression with more aggression. He wasn't pushing back. He was simply redirecting, moving with effortless precision, making Nakamura's attacks look like they had no force behind them at all. With each failed punch, Nakamura's frustration grew. His breaths came faster, his muscles burned from the constant movement, and his strikes became more desperate, more erratic. He couldn't understand why Keanu wasn't fighting back, why his moves were so effortlessly avoided. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated the pace, the one who impressed his students with every flawless move. But now Keanu had stolen that control, and Nakamura was left grasping for it, trying to force it back with every punch he threw. But Keanu's restraint, his unwavering calm, was more than just frustrating. It was humbling. Nakamura was no longer sure of himself. He had spent so long constructing this image of invulnerability, of being the strongest, the best, and yet, here he was, struggling to land a single blow on someone who wasn't even trying to fight him. Keanu's restraint was obvious. He could have easily ended this at any moment. He had the skill, the speed, the ability to neutralize every attack Nakamura threw. Yet, he didn't. He didn't need to. The silence between them had become a lesson, one that Nakamura was starting to realize too late. He had pushed too hard, and now, his own ego was the one that was being exposed. Keanu wasn't playing into his theatrics, wasn't feeding into his need for a grand display. He was simply present, watching, absorbing, and waiting. Nakamura's desperation was only making him look weaker. The students, who had been cheering Nakamura on just moments before, now looked uncertain. Their eyes flicked between their sensei, whose pride was clearly being chipped away with every failed attempt, and Keanu, whose calmness seemed to be rising in stature with every passing second. Some of the younger students were beginning to whisper, wondering if Nakamura's performance was actually failing, if Keanu was actually winning. Despite not throwing a single punch, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. For Nakamura, the realization hit like a hammer. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. This wasn't about who was faster or stronger or more skilled. This was about ego, and Keanu Keanu wasn't playing that game. He didn't need to. In his stillness, in his quiet control, Keanu was teaching a lesson Nakamura wasn't ready to learn. Nakamura launched another flurry of punches, each one more desperate than the last. His fists moved faster, more recklessly now, but Keanu continued to evade, his movements fluid, controlled. It was as though Nakamura's aggression had no effect on him at all. Keanu wasn't just avoiding Nakamura's attacks, he was absorbing the force behind them, redirecting it effortlessly, like a leaf floating in a stream. With a final, wild swing, Nakamura threw a low kick, aiming to catch Keanu's legs off guard, to sweep him off his feet. This time, Nakamura put all his force into it, determined to land something, anything. But Keanu didn't even have to step back. He simply shifted his weight, letting the kick slide by and then pivoting his body slightly to the left. Nakamura's foot met only empty air, and he stumbled forward, thrown off balance by his own momentum. The dojo was completely still now. The sound of Nakamura's breath was the only thing filling the silence. Keanu didn't move to take advantage of Nakamura's stumble. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, calm, poised, his eyes never leaving Nakamura. It was clear now to everyone in the room, Keanu wasn't just reacting to Nakamura's aggression, he was controlling the flow of the fight. Nakamura's own desperation was his downfall. The students were now fully aware of what was happening. They had expected Nakamura's performance to overwhelm Keanu, to show them once again why he was their sensei, their master. But what they were seeing instead was Keanu's quiet mastery, his ability to remain calm in the face of Nakamura's increasingly frantic attempts to prove himself. The lesson was becoming clear. True strength wasn't in the power of the strike, but in the ability to stay composed, to control the energy around you, to let the other person wear themselves out. And Keanu was doing just that. Nakamura, gasping for air, stood in the middle of the dojo, his body shaking, his pride shattered. He had pushed himself to the limit, trying to prove something, anything. But Keanu, with his calm restraint, had done something Nakamura hadn't been able to do. He had stayed calm when faced with aggression, and in doing so, he had shown that true strength was in the stillness, in the silence, between each move. The tension in the dojo had reached its peak, but it wasn't in the punches or kicks thrown. It was in the realization that Nakamura's desperation had only exposed his weaknesses, while Keanu's calmness had revealed a quiet power. The moment of truth had arrived, and Nakamura was beginning to understand that the fight wasn't about winning. It was about control. And Keanu had controlled everything from the very beginning. The dojo was as still as the night, the silence stretching longer than it had ever felt before. Nakamura's breaths were short and uneven, his body aching from the series of failed attacks he had thrown at Keanu. His heart raced with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. How could he have allowed this to happen? He was the sensei, the leader of this dojo. He had built everything with his own two hands, and yet, in this one moment, a quiet observer had exposed him as something less than the legend he had claimed to be. He stood in front of Keanu, sweat dripping from his brow, his fists clenched, his body tense. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes in the dojo. The students were no longer watching in admiration. They were watching him fail, their respect slowly fading with each strike he missed. Nakamura knew it was his last chance. He had to prove he was still in control. He couldn't let this silent, calm figure stand over him. He had to fight back, once and for all. With a deep breath, Nakamura decided to make one final stand. This time, he would go all out. He wouldn't rely on flashy footwork or calculated punches. He wouldn't play to the crowd anymore. This time, he would throw everything he had into a single, decisive strike. This would be the move that ended it all. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing as he focused entirely on Keanu. In a fluid motion, he launched himself forward, his legs twisting in the air as he went for a high-spinning kick aimed directly at Keanu's head. The kick was fast, aggressive, and powerful, designed to catch Keanu off guard, to knock him off his feet, and to end this sparring session with one final, undeniable victory. It had to be now. The dojo was silent as Nakamura spun through the air, his body twisting with precision. His leg arced toward Keanu's head, the force of the move undeniable. It was the perfect strike, the culmination of everything Nakamura had built up to this point. His pride, his skill, his power, it was all channeled into this one attack. He was determined that this time it would land. But Keanu once again did not flinch. His posture remained steady, his gaze calm, almost like he had known this was coming. Nakamura's spinning kick was a blur of motion, a force of nature meant to overwhelm. Yet, with a subtle shift, Keanu stepped in close. He didn't retreat or attempt to dodge. He closed the distance between them, using Nakamura's momentum against him, like a leaf caught in the wind. The movement was so simple, so effortless, that it almost seemed as though Keanu wasn't moving at all. Nakamura's leg, still in mid-spin, swung through empty air as Keanu sidestepped just enough to avoid the blow. Then, with a swift, fluid motion, Keanu's foot swept forward, gently tapping Nakamura's supporting leg. The impact was barely noticeable, but the result was immediate and decisive. Nakamura's balance, already precarious from the spinning kick, faltered. His body, which had been so full of force and aggression moments before, was suddenly caught off guard. In an instant, the world tilted. Nakamura's leg was swept from under him, and he felt the floor rushing toward him. There was no dramatic crash, no heavy thud of a body hitting the mat with the force of a defeated warrior. Instead, Nakamura was gently lowered to the ground, his body landing with a soft, controlled motion. He felt the coolness of the mat beneath him, the realization hitting him like a slow, suffocating tide. He had been bested, not through force, not through violence, but through a quiet, masterful redirection of his own energy. The dojo was frozen in time. Nakamura lay on the floor, his body sprawled out but not hurt, his mind racing, unable to fully process the turn of events. His pride had been stripped away in one move that had been gentle, almost kind. Keanu had the power to end it all, to crush him with force. But instead, he had let Nakamura fall, gently and without malice. The students were silent, their eyes wide as they watched their sensei, the man who had commanded their respect and admiration, lying on the mat in defeat. The shift in power dynamics was almost tangible. It wasn't just the fall that stunned them, it was the way it had happened. Keanu had not used excessive force, not even a fraction of the aggression that Nakamura had thrown at him. It had been a quiet, almost invisible motion that had brought Nakamura down. And the message was clear. Keanu could have ended it at any time. He had the skill, the control, the power to finish the fight with a single strike, yet he had chosen not to. He had let Nakamura fall, not out of pity, but out of respect. It was a lesson in humility, in mastery, and in the kind of restraint that only true strength could possess. The students gasped in unison as Nakamura crashed to the mat. The collective intake of breath echoed through the dojo, the silence heavier than any applause could have been. The tension that had gripped the room moments before now hung in the air like a thick fog. Nakamura lay there, stunned but unharmed, staring up at Keanu's calm, steady figure. Keanu stood over him, his posture as relaxed and controlled as it had been from the beginning. His eyes, never angry, never mocking, simply waited. He didn't gloat. He didn't make a spectacle out of the moment. He simply stood there, allowing Nakamura the time he needed to process what had just happened. The students remained silent, unable to look away from the scene before them. The shift in power dynamics was so sudden, so profound, that it left them questioning everything they thought they knew about strength and mastery. They had come to see a show, but what they had witnessed was a lesson in control, humility, and quiet power. Nakamura finally pushed himself up, his face flushed with the sting of defeat and the realization of his own limitations. As he stood, he met Keanu's gaze, a silent acknowledgement that the match had ended not with force, but with understanding. Nakamura's body trembled as he slowly pushed himself up from the mat. His legs, once full of energy and confidence, now felt heavy and unsteady beneath him. The rush of adrenaline that had fueled his attacks had dissipated, replaced by the undeniable sting of humiliation. He had been the sensei, the one who was supposed to teach, to lead with pride and power. And yet here he was on the ground, his pride shattered by a man who hadn't even raised a hand in anger. He looked up at Keanu, still standing tall and unassuming, offering no signs of triumph. There was no smile, no victory pose, just a calm, almost serene expression, the same quiet presence that had unsettled Nakamura from the start. In that moment, Nakamura's pride flared up once more. I can do this on my own. He didn't need help. He didn't need Keanu's hand. The dojo was still, the students waiting, their eyes fixed on the two men. Nakamura's gaze darted around the room and he could feel the weight of his students' expectations pressing on him. They had witnessed the entire exchange. They had seen Nakamura, the great sensei, fall. And now they were waiting to see what he would do next. What would he show them in this moment of vulnerability? Keanu extended his hand again, but there was no force behind it. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a taunt. It was an offer, simple and silent, an invitation to rise with dignity. The fight was over. There were no words, no applause, just a quiet gesture of respect. Keanu's calmness only served to deepen Nakamura's internal conflict. The sting of his defeat was sharp, but the offer of help, the lack of any judgment, made it sting even more. Nakamura stood there for a moment, his pride battling with his need for respect. His mind raced, filled with thoughts of what his students would think if he accepted Keanu's help. Would they see him as weak? Would they lose faith in him? These were the thoughts that pushed Nakamura's pride to the forefront, urging him to refuse Keanu's hand, to stand on his own and show that he didn't need anyone's help. I am the sensei, the master of this dojo. Yet, as he stood there, staring at Keanu's hand, something began to shift within him. He had spent so many years building up his ego, feeding it with trophies, accolades, and admiration from his students. But in that moment, with Keanu standing before him, Nakamura realized something deep down. True strength wasn't in showing off. It was in knowing when to step back, when to accept help, when to acknowledge one's own vulnerability. Still, Nakamura hesitated, his pride and ego pulling him in one direction, while the quiet power of Keanu's calm presence beckoned him in the other. He could feel the weight of the students' eyes on him, their silent judgment hanging in the air. Nakamura's chest tightened as the silence stretched on. And then, reluctantly, he reached out. The students, who had been watching with bated breath, seemed to exhale collectively as Nakamura finally accepted Keanu's hand. The tension in the room loosened, and even though Nakamura's pride had taken a hit, a small part of him felt something else. It wasn't weakness that he had just admitted, it was humility. Keanu's strength wasn't in defeating him, it wasn't in humiliating him, it was in the quiet way he had navigated the entire encounter, showing Nakamura the true meaning of strength, the strength of restraint. Keanu's hand was steady as Nakamura grasped it, and in that moment, Nakamura felt a shift within himself. There was no malice in Keanu's grip. There was no judgment in his eyes. It was a simple offering, an acknowledgement that the fight, in its most important sense, was over. Nakamura was pulled to his feet, and as he stood, he looked into Keanu's eyes. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with something else. something he hadn't expected to feel in that moment: respect. Keanu's gaze, calm and unwavering, held no trace of triumph. His eyes only conveyed respect. Respect for Nakamura's effort, for his determination, for his willingness to keep fighting even when everything was falling apart. Nakamura had expected the judgment, the gloating that usually came with a defeat. He had expected Keanu to make him feel small, to rub in his failure. But instead, Keanu had treated him with the kind of dignity that made Nakamura's heart ache. As Nakamura stood there, his body still slightly trembling, he realized just how much he had been chasing the wrong thing for so long. He had been focused on his ego, on building up his name, his dojo, his power. He had been consumed by the idea of being the best, the strongest, the most impressive. But now, standing before Keanu, he saw something else entirely. Keanu's strength wasn't in the force of his actions, but in the quiet power of his restraint. The ability to remain calm in the face of aggression, the ability to fight without ever needing to prove a point. These were the qualities Nakamura had never understood until now. He had been so focused on impressing others, on making a spectacle of himself, that he had overlooked the one thing that truly mattered: humility. The students, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, began to stir. There were no loud cheers, no applause, but Nakamura could sense that something had changed in the room. The air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. They weren't looking at him the same way anymore. Their admiration hadn't disappeared. In fact, it seemed to have deepened. They were witnessing something more profound than a fight. They were witnessing a lesson in humility and respect, in the kind of strength that wasn't shown through domination, but through understanding. Keanu didn't need to say anything to make his point. He didn't need to make a grand gesture. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. He had not only shown Nakamura how to fight, but how to live with true strength. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about knowing who you were, about accepting your limitations, and about offering respect to others, even to those who had once tried to tear you down. Nakamura stood there, still holding Keanu's hand, but now the shame that had clouded his mind began to lift. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had been replaced with something else. It was the beginning of understanding, the beginning of a shift in his heart. The dojo had fallen into a deep silence, a stillness that replaced the earlier tension like a thick blanket. The students stood in their places, unsure of what to do or say, their eyes shifting between Nakamura and Keanu. The excitement of the fight had passed, but something deeper had taken root in the room. A kind of introspection, a reflective pause in the flow of the class. Nakamura stood in the center of the mat, his hands at his sides, his chest still heaving from the exertion of the spar. His mind was racing, his thoughts a swirl of frustration, embarrassment, and, for the first time in a long while, self-awareness. He had been humbled. His pride had been shattered in front of his students, and there was no way to escape the fact that the man standing quietly in front of him had shown him the true meaning of strength. It wasn't in the flash of a kick or the intensity of a punch. It wasn't in domination or ego. It was in the calm, the restraint, the ability to absorb and redirect, to let the aggression of others pass by without being consumed by it. Nakamura's gaze fell to the floor for a moment. He could feel the weight of the students' eyes on him, their expectations, their respect. He was their sensei, their teacher, the one who had guided them in martial arts, who had shown them how to be strong and confident. But today, he had failed in front of them, not just as a fighter, but as a leader. He had let his ego take over, and in doing so, he had forgotten the very principles he had once taught. He took a deep breath and lifted his head, meeting the eyes of his students. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual, more reflective, tinged with the humility that had been absent from his earlier commands. "Today, you saw something," he began, his words measured and slow. "Something that I didn't expect, and something I needed to learn. I came into this dojo as I always do, ready to show you what I've worked so hard to become. But today, I let my ego take the lead. I let the desire to prove myself, to show you that I am the best, overshadow what truly matters. The students exchanged uncertain glances. Nakamura wasn't usually this candid. He was always confident, always in control, and the idea of him admitting a mistake was a rare sight. But there was no denying the sincerity in his tone now. They listened in silence, the weight of his words settling in their hearts. "I have always taught you that strength is something you have to show," Nakamura continued, his eyes now scanning the faces of his students. "I made it about the moves, the flashy kicks, the power, the trophies on the wall. I made it about the performance. But the truth is, strength isn't in what you can show others. It's in what you can control within yourself. Real strength is in restraint, in humility. It's in knowing when to fight and when to simply be, when to stand firm without needing to prove anything." He paused for a moment, the words hanging in the air. There was a heaviness to his admission, a shift in the way he saw himself and the way he expected his students to see him. He could feel his pride bruised, but he didn't care anymore. What mattered now was the lesson he needed to impart. The students were still silent, absorbing every word. Some looked uncertain, still trying to reconcile the sensei they had known with the man standing before them now. Others, however, were nodding slowly, as if they were beginning to understand what Nakamura was saying. Nakamura's eyes drifted to Keanu, standing quietly at the edge of the mat. Keanu's calm, unwavering presence had been the key to his realization. Nakamura had spent years building an image of himself, but it was Keanu's quiet strength that had brought him back to the core of what martial arts was truly about. It wasn't the spectacle. It was the soul of the practice, and in that, Keanu had shown him something more profound than any fight he had ever won. "Keanu," Nakamura said, his voice softening, "I'm sorry. I allowed my pride to get in the way of what I should have been teaching. You've shown me a lesson I will never forget. It's not about fighting. It's about knowing when not to fight." Keanu stood still, his eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding they had held throughout the entire sparring session. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to say anything at all. His actions, his calm restraint, had already done all the teaching needed. Keanu simply nodded, acknowledging Nakamura's words without any fanfare. There was no pride in his gesture, no judgment, just a quiet acceptance. Nakamura turned back to his students, his voice gaining a sense of finality as he continued. "I've always said that we must never stop striving for greatness, but greatness isn't found in beating others, in impressing them, or in our own accolades. It's found in how we treat each other, how we control ourselves, and how we remain humble in the face of success and failure alike." He exhaled deeply, as if releasing something heavy from his chest. "I've failed you today. I've failed to live up to the standard I set for myself. But I want you all to know that the greatest lesson I can teach you now is this. Real strength comes from within, not from showmanship, not from the applause, but from how we hold ourselves when no one is watching, and from the humility to know that sometimes we must step aside and let others lead the way, even if we've always thought we were the ones who should be leading." Nakamura's voice softened, his gaze steady. "So, I ask you to remember this moment, and to remember that the true mark of a master is not in how loudly they shout, but in how calmly they stand when the world expects them to fight." Keanu stood at the edge of the dojo, his figure casting a long shadow in the soft light. The atmosphere in the room was markedly different than when he had entered earlier. The students were still, but now there was a quiet reverence in the air, a sense of calm that had replaced the frantic energy of the earlier sparring match. Nakamura, having spoken his piece, stood in the background, watching with a contemplative look on his face. Keanu didn't seek attention or recognition. There were no grand farewells, no applause for his quiet strength. He didn't need that. His actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. As he turned toward the young boy who had been practicing earlier, "Daiki." Keanu's gaze softened, his expression warm. The boy, who had been standing near the edge of the mat, watching the exchange, now looked up at Keanu with wide eyes. His excitement was palpable, his little body practically vibrating with energy, a mix of awe and inspiration that filled the space between them. Keanu approached Daiki with a gentle step, his voice quiet but firm. "You did well today," he said, his words simple yet meaningful. "Keep working at it, and don't be afraid to stumble. It's not about being perfect, it's about getting up every time you fall." Daiki's face broke into a wide grin, the kind that only a child could wear, bright, unrestrained, and full of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Keanu," the boy exclaimed, his voice high-pitched with excitement. Keanu nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "You've got the heart of a true fighter," Keanu added, his voice steady and encouraging. "That's all that matters in the end." Daiki's eyes sparkled with admiration. He had seen the fight between Keanu and Nakamura, but now he was seeing something else, something even more important. He was seeing the quiet strength that came from being patient, being humble, and never rushing to prove anything to anyone. As Daiki continued to beam with excitement, Nakamura watched from a distance, his arms crossed and his posture still. There was no more anger, no more frustration in his expression. He was lost in thought, reflecting on everything that had happened, the fight, the lessons, and the man who had delivered them with such calm. He had expected Keanu to be a force of nature in the dojo, to be a whirlwind of power and speed. Instead, he had been a calming presence, a quiet strength that had turned Nakamura's world upside down. Keanu didn't need to flaunt his skills. He didn't need to show off or prove anything. He simply was. And Nakamura realized that this stillness, this quiet humility, was the true measure of strength. Keanu had taken the time to see the small boy struggling, to offer him encouragement, not out of any obligation, but because he saw something in him. Nakamura, watching this interaction, felt a flicker of gratitude in his chest. The dojo, once filled with the noise of punches and kicks, now felt like a place of quiet reflection. There was no applause, no clapping, no outward recognition. Keanu's departure was not marked by any grand gestures. He simply turned back toward the sliding door, ready to leave. As he moved toward the door, Keanu paused, turning his head slightly, as if sensing Nakamura's gaze. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There were no words exchanged, but the understanding between them was clear. Nakamura nodded, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired, of the lesson Keanu had imparted, without uttering a single word of reproach or judgment. The lesson had been delivered in silence, and Nakamura was beginning to understand it on a deeper level than he ever could have through words alone. Keanu didn't seek any recognition for himself. As he reached the door, he slipped on his jacket once again, the same jacket he had worn when he first entered. His movements were unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. The neon sign outside flickered faintly, casting a blue glow into the dojo, but Keanu was unfazed by it. He was leaving, not because he had accomplished anything, but because it was time. His role in the dojo was over, and in his quiet departure, he was teaching one final lesson. Keanu slid open the door, the faint hum of the neon sign outside the dojo filling the silence just before he stepped out. The cool evening air greeted him as he walked toward the street, his pace slow and steady, as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't look back. His presence in the dojo had already done its work. There was no need for words, no need for recognition. His simple act of quiet strength had spoken volumes, and now it was time for him to disappear as quietly as he had arrived. Inside the dojo, Nakamura stood still, his hands loosely folded in front of him as he silently watched Keanu leave. The weight of the lesson still hung heavily in the air, settling in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. Nakamura's mind churned with everything he had just experienced, and for the first time, he could truly feel the shift in his own understanding of what it meant to be a master, what it meant to lead. Keanu's humility had done what no flashy technique or victory could ever do. It had broken through his arrogance, exposing the cracks in his pride that he had never been willing to face before. The students, still gathered on the mat, exchanged looks. They had seen their sensei defeated not by power, but by presence. They had seen Keanu's quiet strength in action, and though none of them said a word, the change in them was evident. They weren't just watching a fight. They were witnessing a transformation. As Keanu disappeared into the night, Nakamura's gaze followed him for a brief moment, his thoughts a quiet storm of gratitude and self-reflection. With a soft sigh, he turned back to the students, a new sense of understanding in his heart. The lesson was far from over, and it would shape not just his teachings, but his life, from this day forward. The dojo had taken on a different energy since Keanu's departure. The students, who had once been full of the usual youthful energy and ambition, were now noticeably quieter, more introspective. Their movements on the mat were more deliberate, more focused. The spectacle that had once driven them, performing impressive kicks and striking poses for the admiration of others, was no longer the goal. They had witnessed something far more profound, something that didn't require flair or showmanship to be powerful. They had witnessed the quiet strength of Keanu, and the impact of that was still settling in their hearts. Nakamura stood at the front of the dojo, his posture more relaxed than it had ever been before. His chest, which had once puffed out with pride as he demonstrated techniques and told grand stories of past triumphs, now rose and fell with a new sense of humility. His movements, though still precise, lacked the same aggressive energy that had characterized his teaching style in the past. The sharp, commanding tone that had once marked his every word had softened, and now his voice was steady and calm. No longer an attempt to dominate the room, but to guide it. He began the class the way he always had, walking among the students as they practiced their forms. But this time, his approach was different. There was no urgency in his steps. He didn't bark orders or correct every minor mistake with impatience. Instead, he watched the students with an observant eye, offering gentle adjustments here and there, but never raising his voice in anger. His eyes no longer gleamed with the desire to be the best. There was a quiet acceptance in his gaze. He was teaching them how to find balance, not just in their movements, but in their minds. The first few students noticed the change immediately. Daiki, the young boy who had practiced so diligently before, stood taller now, his movements more assured. He no longer rushed through his stances, eager to impress. Instead, he took his time, each movement purposeful, measured. It was as if he had learned to breathe with his movements, allowing the practice to flow rather than forcing it. He wasn't trying to impress Nakamura or anyone else in the dojo. He was simply practicing for himself. Nakamura moved closer to him, watching him for a moment before offering a quiet suggestion. "Slow your breath, Daiki. Feel the floor beneath you. It will guide you if you listen." Daiki nodded, a look of concentration on his face as he refocused on his stance. There was no need to speak further. The lesson had been delivered simply, and Daiki took it in without any need for further explanation. As the class continued, Nakamura noticed something else, something he hadn't anticipated. The students no longer looked to him for validation. They weren't seeking praise for every well-executed move or flashy technique. Instead, they seemed to be more focused on themselves, on their own growth. It was as if the emphasis had shifted from external recognition to internal mastery. They no longer cared about the trophies on the wall or the applause from the crowd. They were here to learn, to develop discipline, and to find peace within their practice. Nakamura watched this shift in his students with a sense of quiet pride. "This is what I've been trying to teach all along," he thought to himself. But until Keanu had shown up, until he had been forced to confront his own ego, he had never truly understood the depth of what it meant to be a teacher. It wasn't about leading by fear or showing off the grandeur of your own abilities. It was about creating a space for students to find their own strength, their own balance, and their own peace. In the corner of the dojo, one of the older students, a woman who had been with Nakamura for years, paused during her kata and turned toward him. "Sensei," she said, her voice hesitant but filled with curiosity, "the class feels different today. What's changed?" Nakamura turned to her, meeting her gaze with a gentle smile. "It's not what's changed, but what we've realized," he replied, his voice calm. "We've been so focused on winning, on being the best, that we've forgotten the purpose of martial arts. It's about balance, not just power. It's about humility, not pride." The student nodded thoughtfully, taking in his words. The others, hearing the conversation, paused for a moment in their practice, their attention drawn to Nakamura's newfound wisdom. The room felt different now, less like a place to compete, and more like a space for personal reflection and growth. Nakamura continued to move among the students, offering soft guidance when needed, but never pushing too hard. His tone remained calm, his steps deliberate. He began to introduce small moments of mindfulness into the lesson, encouraging the students to breathe deeply, to clear their minds before each movement. There was no rush, no hurry. The clock on the wall seemed irrelevant now. Time had slowed in the dojo, just as it had for Nakamura. He moved toward the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the students. The trophies on the wall, once symbols of competition and achievement, now seemed almost irrelevant. They were still there, but they didn't carry the same weight they once had. The true measure of success, Nakamura realized, was no longer in the awards or the accolades. It was in the quiet moments of personal growth, in the dedication to the practice, and in the humility to learn from every failure. The dojo, which had once been filled with the energy of competition, now resonated with something deeper: peace. Nakamura, in his quiet reflection, understood that this shift was the true reward, not just for him, but for all of his students. As the class continued, Nakamura observed the students with a new sense of pride. They were moving with purpose, not for recognition, but for self-improvement. He could feel the change in the dojo, a shift from spectacle to substance. The students were more focused, more grounded, and the energy was calm yet vibrant with growth. Nakamura's lessons now were filled with reflection. Each movement, each stance was an opportunity to learn and be present. The dojo was no longer just a place of skill. It was a space for cultivating strength from within, not just for external accolades. The dojo had quieted down as the class came to an end. The students lined up waiting for Nakamura to speak, but this time the energy in the room was different. It wasn't the usual buzz of excitement or the murmur of chatter about techniques or moves. It was a calm, reflective silence, as if everyone was waiting for something deeper to be shared. Nakamura stood at the front of the room, his posture more relaxed than usual, his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes, once filled with pride and a sense of invincibility, now carried a depth of understanding. For the first time, Nakamura didn't feel the need to stand tall in front of them. He wasn't trying to impress them with his knowledge or authority. Instead, he spoke quietly, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "Today," he began, his gaze sweeping across his students, "I want to talk about humility, about respect, and about what it means to truly master something. Not just martial arts, but life itself." The students listened intently. They had seen Nakamura's transformation over the past few days, the way his approach to teaching had softened, the way his lessons now carried a deeper wisdom. But there was more to it. They could feel the sincerity in his words, the weight of everything he had learned, and the lessons he was now passing on. I have always taught you to be strong, to fight with everything you have, Nakamura continued, his voice carrying a soft authority. And that's important. Strength is vital, but strength doesn't come from how loud you are or how much you can show off. It doesn't come from the trophies on the wall or from proving you're better than anyone else. Strength comes from within. It comes from understanding that no matter how skilled you are, there is always something to learn from others. And most importantly, it comes from knowing when to step back and allow others to teach you. The students exchanged looks, some nodding slowly, others still processing the weight of Nakamura's words. They had grown up under his guidance, following his every command with the belief that his word was final. But now they were beginning to understand that true mastery wasn't about following someone's lead blindly. It was about learning from every experience, from every person you met along the way. Nakamura paused for a moment, his eyes dropping to the floor, as if reflecting on his own journey. I had the privilege of learning from someone today, he said quietly. Someone who taught me a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Keanu. He allowed the name to linger in the air, and the students sat up a little straighter. The man who had so effortlessly humbled their sensei. Keanu didn't come here to show off his skills, Nakamura continued. He didn't come here to prove that he was better than any of us. He came here quietly, without fanfare, and showed us what true strength looks like. He didn't need to fight with anger or with force. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply showed us that there's power in calmness, in restraint, in not reacting to every challenge with aggression. The students were silent now, taking in every word. They could feel the shift in their own minds, the change that had happened in Nakamura, and now they could feel it in themselves as well. The idea that strength came not from showing off or overwhelming others, but from controlling one's own impulses, from staying calm under pressure. That was a lesson they hadn't expected to learn today, but it had been taught to them without words, without a show of force, and now it resonated deeply within them. Keanu could have ended that sparring match at any time, Nakamura continued, his voice tinged with respect. He could have made it look easy, could have humiliated me in front of all of you. But he didn't. He didn't do that because he didn't need to. And that's what real mastery is. It's not about winning every fight, every time. It's about knowing when to fight, when to step back, and when to show compassion, even in defeat. The students, still processing the impact of the sparring match and Nakamura's words, began to see their sensei in a new light. Nakamura had always been a man of great skill, but now they saw him as someone who was willing to learn from those who had no need to prove themselves. They saw that he had not only learned humility, but had the courage to show it to them, to admit his own failings. Nakamura's gaze lifted again, meeting the eyes of his students. I want you all to remember this lesson. Don't chase after victories for the sake of proving yourself. Chase them for the sake of growing, for the sake of learning. The true measure of your strength is not in how many fights you win or how many trophies you collect. It's in how you carry yourself, how you treat others, and how you grow each day. His voice softened even more. And always remember, there is no shame in learning from others, no matter who they are or where they come from. True strength lies in being open to what others can teach you, even when you think you have nothing left to learn. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Nakamura's words hanging in the air. The students didn't need to speak. They didn't need to shout their approval. The change was already happening within them, just as it had within Nakamura. Nakamura's gaze softened as he looked at them one last time. This is our dojo, our space to grow. Let's make it a place where we don't just learn techniques, but where we learn about ourselves, about humility, and about the quiet strength that comes from within. With that, he bowed to his students, a deep and sincere gesture that spoke volumes. The students in turn bowed to him, their movements slower, more thoughtful than they had been before. The respect they had for him was no longer just for his strength, but for the humility and self-awareness he had shown them. Nakamura stood, his heart full. The students, silently reflecting, knew the dojo had transformed. Keanu's influence remained. The class had come to an end and the dojo felt still. The earlier hum of activity had quieted down, leaving behind only the soft sound of breathing and the faint rustle of uniforms as students adjusted their stances, unsure of how to proceed. Their minds, still processing everything that had transpired, lingered on the lessons that Nakamura had shared. The atmosphere was no longer charged with competition or excitement, but instead filled with a contemplative calm, a reverence that had settled in the hearts of each student. Nakamura stood at the front, his posture no longer as rigid as it once had been. There was a softness in his stance, a humility that hadn't been there before. He had always been the sensei, the leader, the one everyone looked up to with admiration. But now, the students saw him in a new light, not just as a teacher, but as a man who had learned something valuable, something he hadn't been willing to face before. In front of them stood a different Nakamura, one who had been humbled, not through defeat, but through understanding. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was calm and full of sincerity. "I've had the privilege of learning something today, and I believe that it's something you all deserve to hear." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the students, who had been waiting for the final lesson of the day, listened more intently than ever. They could feel the difference in Nakamura's tone, the quiet wisdom in his words. "The lesson I've learned," Nakamura continued, "is that strength isn't about power or dominance. It's not about trophies or recognition. It's not about being the loudest or the most impressive. Strength is about humility. It's about knowing your own limits, being able to step back when needed, and respecting others, especially those who carry the quiet strength that doesn't need to be shown. We've all seen that today, not just in Keanu's actions, but in his presence. The strength to remain calm, to not react, to simply be." The students remained still, taking in Nakamura's words. Some of them had come to see martial arts as a way to prove themselves, to earn respect through strength and performance. But now, with the image of Keanu still fresh in their minds, they were beginning to understand that there was a deeper, more profound lesson beneath the surface of their training. The idea that true strength lay in restraint, in quiet composure, and in the ability to not let ego or pride dictate their actions was something new. It wasn't something they had been taught before, not in such clear terms. Nakamura's gaze turned toward the back of the room, where Keanu stood, ready to leave. The sensei's voice softened as he spoke again. "Keanu, I want to thank you for the lesson you've taught us. You didn't have to say a word, but your actions spoke louder than anything I could have taught in 1,000 lessons. You've shown us that humility and strength are not opposites, but companions." Keanu, standing at the back of the room, offered a small nod in return. There were no words, no grand gestures, just a quiet acknowledgement of the mutual respect between them. In that moment, it wasn't about Keanu's victory or Nakamura's defeat. It was about the shared understanding that true mastery came from within, and that the ability to learn from others was a strength in itself. Keanu had not only humbled Nakamura through his restraint, but had also given him the space to reflect and grow. Nakamura turned back to his students, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. "I hope you all see this as I do," he said, his voice steady. "The dojo is not just a place to train the body. It is a place to train the mind, to cultivate humility, and to learn from everyone around you. Today I learned something I never expected. I learned that the greatest strength comes not from overpowering others, but from knowing when to step aside and let others teach you." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "From now on, I'll be teaching you not just techniques, but mindfulness, reflection, and respect, for yourselves and for others. This is a journey we are all on, and there is always something to learn. The most important thing is to remain humble, to never stop growing, and to always show respect to those who possess true mastery, no matter who they are. As Nakamura finished speaking, there was a shift in the room, a collective understanding. The students stood taller, but not in arrogance. They stood taller because they were beginning to understand that the real measure of strength wasn't in how many battles they won, but in how they approached life and their practice. They were no longer looking for applause, they were looking for personal growth, for mastery of both their body and their mind. The trophies and accolades on the wall seemed less important now. What mattered more was the journey ahead. Nakamura gave a small bow to his students, a gesture of both respect and humility. The students in turn bowed deeply to him. It was a moment of shared understanding, one that had been built not through words or fancy techniques, but through the quiet, humbling lesson of one man's experience. Keanu, standing near the door, took a final glance at the room before stepping outside. His presence, though subtle, had left an indelible mark on the dojo. As he walked into the night, the figure of the man who had taught them all without saying a word began to disappear into the distance. The students remained where they were, contemplating everything they had just witnessed. As Keanu disappeared into the night, the dojo remained still. The students, still in quiet contemplation, reflected on the lessons of humility and strength. Nakamura stood at the front, silently proud. What do you think about humility and strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below.